The accountability gap in military AI is 80 years old. It did not begin with algorithms or machine learning. It began with a flying bomb, preset to land wherever physics carried it, with no human responsible for where it fell. This is the Hamberger Report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, enterprise architect and governance practitioner, Wellington. On the 13th of June 1944, a small winged aircraft appeared over the Kent coast before dawn. Distinctive buzzing sound, engine cut out, dive. The first V-1 flying bomb struck East London at 4:25 in the morning. 6 people were killed. Over the following 9 months, 9,521s were launched against Britain, killing approximately 5,500 people and injuring 16,000 more. The V-1 was significant not for its destructive power, but for its design logic. Once launched, no human controlled it. A gyroscope maintained heading, a mechanical counter measured distance and triggered a dive at the preset range. The weapon made its decision before it left the ramp. That separation of decision from impact is the accountability gap in its original form, not a side effect of the design. On the 3rd of July 1988, the Aegis combat system aboard a United States Navy warship tracked an Airbus climbing out of Bandar Abbas Airport. The data was correct, precise to the second. The ship was mid-engagement, heeling at 32 degrees, its guns firing at Iranian speedboats. Inside the Combat Information Center, a software flaw had reassigned one track number to a Navy jet elsewhere that was genuinely descending. When the commander asked for a status update on that number, he was told the contact was a fighter, speed 450 knots, descending. An operator had incorrectly matched a military transponder reading with the departing airliner. At 10:24 and 22 seconds, 2 surface-to-air mislaunched. Both struck the aircraft. Iran Air Flight 655 fell from the sky. 290 people were killed, among them 66 children. The Aegis system had performed as designed throughout. The data was correct to the second. Nobody on that aircraft was a combatant. A demonstration how an automated lethal system creates the accountability gap even when working correctly. The ship's data tapes were unambiguous. They showed the aircraft on a normal commercial flight profile, ascending continuously, squawking the civilian transponder code. The nearest American warship had independently identified it as civilian. The discrepancy between what the system recorded and what the crew reported came down to automation bias, fitting incoming data to a pre-existing threat model rather than re-evaluating it under cognitive load. The official investigation concluded the commander had acted reasonably. No one was court-martialed, no one was reprimanded. 2 years after the incident, the commander received a prestigious military decoration for outstanding service. The citation made no mention of the 290 dead. 8 years later, the families received a settlement. $61.8 million. No apology. No admission of liability. The United States described it as a humanitarian gesture. The formal structure of accountability was, in every meaningful sense, empty. The commander had claimed full personal responsibility. Nobody was held responsible. That is not a paradox. It is the accountability gap in operation. In October 1983, the United States Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency presented a document to Congress. Its stated objective: autonomous land, sea and air vehicles capable of complex far-ranging attack missions, not a projection. The stated goal: over the following decade, the agency spent over $1 billion on the program. 92 projects at 60 institutions, half in industry, half in universities and government laboratories. What none of these projects included was a governance component. Across $1 billion and 92 projects, nobody designed a parallel program asking whether autonomous attack systems should be subject to any legal framework before deployment. No researcher considered the accountability implications of removing human control from lethal decisions. The question it never asked was, who answers when it kills the wrong people? The formal governance directive requiring appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of lethal force was not issued until November 2012, 29 years after the agency had told Congress what it intended to build. 29 years. $1 billion, zero governance. The Gulf War of 1991 was the first conflict in which precision-guided munitions were presented to global television audiences as the defining feature of modern warfare. Night after night, targeting cameras, crosshairs, a brief flash, the target destroyed. What the footage did not show was the other 92%. Precision-guided munitions were approximately 8% of total ordnance. The remaining 92% were unguided, conventional weapons delivered from altitude. After the conflict, the Pentagon acknowledged that approximately 70% of bombs dropped had missed their intended targets. The 8% that were precision-guided accounted for 75% of all successful strikes. That statistic was accurate. What it obscured was everything else. Tens of thousands of unguided weapons dropped on a country whose civilian population was underneath them. The framing of civilian casualties did real work. Collateral damage converted an accountability question into a technical one. When a bomb killed civilians, the question was no longer who decided to drop it. It became, was the weapon accurate? That distinction became the template for military AI accountability for the next 3 decades. Precision of the weapon as a substitute for accountability for the decision. Baghdad, 4:30 in the morning, the 13th of February, 1991. A public shelter used by families, children, and elderly residents. One of the last buildings in the city with electricity and running water. Intelligence had reclassified the structure as a military command post. The intelligence was wrong. The signals came from a communications facility approximately 270 meters away. Interviews later established the building was clearly marked as a public shelter and had been used by civilians throughout the air campaign. 2 precision-guided bombs struck at 4:30 in the morning. At least 408 civilians died. Most were women, children, and elderly people. 15 survived. The munitions worked exactly as designed. They struck precisely where they were aimed. The targeting system that nominated the shelter worked exactly as designed, processing available intelligence and producing a target recommendation. Nobody was held accountable for 408 deaths. No officer was censured. No investigation produced a finding of fault. The families of the dead had no legal mechanism to hold anyone accountable. Precision improved. Accountability did not. That sequencing is the story of every episode in this series. From the first V1 ramp in 1944, to the Aegis system in 1988, to the Precision campaign of 1991, capability advanced and governance did not follow. The program that spent $1 billion building autonomous attack vehicles spent zero on governance. The Gulf War built a precision narrative that concealed the accountability question behind a percentage and a phrase. The systems deployed since 2015 have made even that limited visibility conditional. Targeting systems processing thousands of decisions per day. Drones making engagement decisions in seconds. Autonomous munitions flying with no human controller and no kill chain. In each case, the question is the same one asked in 1988 and never satisfactorily answered. Who decided? Who is responsible? Who can be held to account? The book this series is drawn from states 5 conditions that would constitute meaningful evidence. The gap was closing. As of publication, none had been met. This episode examined where that gap began. The rest of the series examines how it grew. In 2001, on the opening night of the Afghan War, a Central Intelligence Agency team in Virginia fired a missile from a Predator drone 11,000 kilometers away. The legal authority for that strike took 4 years to surface. The architecture has not changed. This is the Hamberger Report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, Enterprise Architect, Wellington. That single strike opened a program that ran for 8 years before any external authority reviewed its legal basis. The architecture for accountability was not missing by accident. It was never built. This is the second episode of Lethal by Design, the 9-part Friday series drawn from the book. Last week we set out the 80-year-old gap between weapons capability and accountability. This week, the system that scaled that gap into a template. The Predator did 3 things at once. It put the pilot in Nevada, it put the analyst at Langley, it put the lawyer in Washington. None of those people was the decision maker. The decision was the system. The early Predator strikes targeted named individuals. Mullah Omar, Mohammed Atef, specific commanders whose faces appeared on briefing slides and whose voices were intercepted by signals intelligence. In January 2008, that premise was abandoned. A presidential authorization expanded the agency's targeting criteria from named individuals to patterns of activity. The operators no longer needed to know who the target was. The target's behavior was enough. This is what was called a signature strike. The signature was a gathering of military-aged men in a known area, a pattern consistent with militancy. The classification system did the rest. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism documented one strike in North Waziristan in March 2011 that killed 41 civilians at a tribal meeting about a mining contract. The Pakistani military had been notified 10 days in advance. The American ambassador tried to halt the strike. He was overruled by the station chief. An anonymous official told the New York Times the men were terrorists. They were in fact settling a dispute over a chromite mine. The pilot of the strike that killed Anwar al-Awlaki was in the continental United States. The strike took place in Yemen. The target was an American citizen. Anwar al-Awlaki was born in New Mexico. He had not been charged, tried, or convicted of any crime. The legal basis for his killing was a 41-page classified memorandum written by an assistant attorney general named David Barron, dated July 2010. The memo concluded he could be lawfully killed because he posed an imminent threat and capturing him was not feasible. The memo's definition of imminent took 8 pages. 8 pages to explain what imminent means is not legal clarity, it is legal construction. The word was stretched to cover a permanent condition rather than a proximate event. Under the definition Barron supplied, any individual designated as an active member of an enemy organization posed an imminent threat at all times, regardless of what they were actually doing at any given moment. The Barron memo was classified for nearly 4 years, a legal opinion so secret that no court would ever review it, no citizen would ever challenge it, and no foreign government would ever cite it. When it finally appeared on the front page of the New York Times in June 2014, after a Senate confirmation battle and a federal court order, it revealed not a rogue operation, but a considered institutional architecture, built deliberately, designed for concealment. 3 legal challenges to the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki failed. The first was dismissed before the strike for lack of standing. The second was dismissed after the strike on sovereign immunity grounds. A parallel challenge in the United Kingdom against British intelligence sharing was dismissed under the Foreign Act of State doctrine. Next Friday's episode, The Corporate Kill Chain, traces what happened when the same accountability architecture moved from government to industry, when Silicon Valley discovered what its targeting infrastructure was being used for, walked out, and watched somebody else build the next version. The Hamberger report publishes daily across 7 series. Lethal by Design runs Fridays through to early September. The historical record this episode has set out is also a present-day procurement record. The accountability frameworks designed to govern lethal autonomous weapons systems are mature documents. Article 36 of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions requires every party to review new weapons for compliance with international humanitarian law before deployment. United States Department of Defense Directive 3000.09 governs autonomous weapons development inside the Pentagon. The United Kingdom Ministry of Defence's Joint Service Publication 936 covers the same ground for British forces. For boards and chief information officers in New Zealand, procuring AI decision support tools, the question is not whether your vendor has touched the defense market. The question is whether the procurement contract makes the system's decisions reconstructible, contestable, and held to a named accountability standard. The same vendor architectures that deliver the targeting infrastructure described in this episode are the architectures now being sold into commercial enterprise. The frameworks exist. The contractual discipline to invoke them is the procurement decision that has to be made by the buyer. The classification system did the work the law was supposed to do. The enemy killed in action designation was applied automatically to any military-aged male killed in a strike zone unless evidence subsequently emerged to prove otherwise. Neither the military nor the agency had institutional incentive to produce that evidence. A strike killed a group of men in a known militant area. The dead were classified as enemies. No investigation followed. The next strike was authorized on the same intelligence picture. The system produced its own evidence of its own success. This was not a glitch, it was the process. The National Security Agency contribution made the algorithmic parallel explicit. A program called Skynet applied machine learning to mobile phone metadata to identify potential couriers in Pakistan. A second program called Gilgamesh mounted signals intelligence payloads on drones to harvest phone data from the ground below. The first documented use of algorithmic analysis to feed the lethal kill chain, named after a science fiction artificial intelligence designed to end human species. The name was not ironic. 2 weeks after his father was killed, 16-year-old Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki was eating dinner with his cousins in Shabwa province, Yemen. He had been born in Denver, Colorado. He was not on any kill list. A Central Intelligence Agency drone killed him on the 14th of October 2011. The intended target was not present. Abdul Rahman was. The administration's explanation came not from an official statement, but from a comment by the former White House press secretary at a campaign event. He said the teenager should have had a more responsible father. No investigation was announced. No compensation was offered. The accountability gap is the distance between the people who chose to build a system that could not answer for what it did and the people who lived beneath it. Next Friday, when the same architecture moved from Langley to Silicon Valley, this has been the Hamberger Report. This is the Hamberger Report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, Enterprise Architect, Wellington. In early 2026, a single software platform generated more than 1,000 targeting coordinates in the first 24 hours of a military operation, faster than any team of humans could review them. That system did not appear from nowhere. Its foundations were laid almost a decade earlier by engineers at a private technology company who built the capability, then tried to walk away from it. This is the story of the corporate kill chain. How the work of finding and fixing a target was handed to private industry. How the people who built it refused to continue, and how that refusal moved the contract without changing the capability. The accountability gap this series has traced through governments now runs straight through the supply chain of the companies those governments buy from. In 2017, the United States Department of Defense began a program to apply artificial intelligence to military drone footage. It was called Project Maven. The work of analyzing the imagery went to a private contractor, Google. The contract was small, by defense standards, around $9 million, a one-year agreement to build computer vision models that could scan hours of surveillance video and flag objects of interest, vehicles, buildings, people. The military had far more footage than human analysts could ever watch. The promise of Maven was that a machine would watch it instead and tell a human where to look. This was not a weapon. It was the layer directly above the weapon, the system that decides what counts as a target before anyone in the chain sees it. Google's leadership took the contract quietly. Most of the company did not know it existed. When the engineers found out, the response was immediate. In April 2018, more than 3,000 Google employees signed an open letter to the company's chief executive. The first line was blunt. The company should not be in the business of war. Dozens of engineers resigned. 2 months later, Google announced it would not renew the Maven contract when it lapsed and published a set of artificial intelligence principles, promising it would not design or field AI for weapons. For a moment, the walkout looked like it had won. It had not. The company withdrew from a $10 billion military cloud contract that same year, then re-entered the defense market through other agreements. In early 2025, the clause promising never to build AI for weapons was quietly removed from the principles page. The capability Maven represented did not disappear when Google stepped back. It moved. The only thing that changed was whose name sat on the contract. The company that took the space Google left did not sell a single product. It sold a platform. Palantir, a data analytics firm, built the operating system for military targeting itself. Its founder had argued for years that the aim of a business is not to compete, but to build something no rival can replace. The platform did exactly that. It pulled satellite feeds, sensor data, signals intelligence, and drone imagery into one interface that turned raw information into ranked targets. By early 2026, more than 20,000 military users were working inside it, up from around 5,000 18 months earlier. The system had become a program of record, permanent procurement, not a trial. Next Friday's episode turns to Ukraine, the first conflict where civilian volunteers, commercial satellites, and machine-assisted targeting combined at full operational scale, and where the question of who authorized what became almost impossible to answer. The Hamberger report publishes daily across 7 series, and this series runs every Friday through to late August. The history this episode has set out is also a present-day procurement record. The frameworks meant to govern lethal autonomous capability already exist. They are mature documents and most buyers never invoke them. Article 36 of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions requires every state to review a new weapon for compliance with international humanitarian law before it is fielded. United States Department of Defense Directive 3000.09 governs autonomous functions in weapon systems. These are named accountability standards, and they are decades old. For boards and chief information officers in New Zealand buying artificial intelligence decision support tools, the relevant question is not whether a vendor has ever touched the defense market. It is whether the contract makes the system's outputs reconstructible and held to a named standard, and whether those safeguards survive a change in the vendor's commercial position or ownership. The same platforms that rank targets in this episode are now sold into commercial enterprise. The frameworks exist. Invoking them is the buyer's decision. One of the AI companies supplying these systems had drawn a line. It would not allow its models to be used for fully autonomous targeting or for mass surveillance. Those were written conditions, published commitments. In early 2026, the platform was used at scale in a military operation. More than 1,000 targeting coordinates generated in the first day at a tempo no human review process was built to match. The government then designated the AI company as supply chain risk to national security, a label until then reserved for firms linked to foreign adversaries, and ordered agencies to stop using its models. The company refused to drop its conditions and went to court. A federal judge granted a temporary injunction. Through all of it, the model kept running inside the platform, because by then it was embedded too deeply to switch off at the speed a war demanded. Another AI company moved to take the space, the red line held in writing. It did not hold in operation. Across this episode, the same pattern repeats. A capability is built. The people who build it raise an objection. The objection moves the contract without changing the capability. None of it required a malfunction. Every step was a decision. Someone chose to outsource the targeting layer to private industry. Someone chose to accept a contract. Someone chose to write a safeguard. And someone chose to keep the system running when that safeguard was tested. The gap between who builds the targeting and who answers for what it selects was not left open by accident. It was procured, one contract at a time, by buyers who treated accountability as someone else's clause. The frameworks to close it exist. The engineers who refuse proved the objection can be raised. What is missing is the discipline to make the objection bind. So here is the question: when the safeguard is only as strong as the contract behind it, who actually holds the line? In 2014, Ukrainian volunteers began turning shopboard drones into weapons during the annexation of Crimea. 12 years on, no law can say who is accountable when one of them kills. This is the Hamberger Report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, Enterprise Architect, Wellington. Ukraine is the first war where 3 things arrived together. At full scale, weapons built by civilians, in basements, from parts anyone can order online. Targeting that a machine completes after the human can no longer intervene. And a layer of commercial platforms owned by private companies without which neither would work. Each of the 3 was a choice. Each widened the same gap. The accountability question, this argument has tracked for 9 chapters, arrives here in a form The law was never written to answer. Not because no one is responsible, because responsibility is now spread across a chain with no center where every hand makes a partial decision and no hand makes a whole one. What follows traces three dimensions of that gap: how it was democratized, how a single jammer made human control physically impossible, and how the most effective targeting in this war runs on infrastructure governed by terms of service, not rules of engagement. Before the invasion, she was an award-winning florist. People stopped buying flowers, so she learned engineering. Now she builds attack drones in a basement, hundreds a month. She holds no rank. She answers to no chain of command. By 2024, Ukraine had around 500 drone makers, from industrial plants to apartment workshops. Together, they built more than 2 million drones in a single year. A standard attack drone costs $300 to $500. The artillery shell that does comparable damage costs thousands, a guided missile tens of thousands. By analyst estimates, those drones account for most of the Russian equipment destroyed on the front. Now follow one strike through the chain that makes it. A volunteer builds the airframe. A startup supplies the guidance chip. Another volunteer fits the warhead. A soldier picks the target. An onboard algorithm completes the strike after the signal is gone. 5 hands. 5 partial decisions. Not one of them is a whole decision, made by someone with the authority, the information, and the legal duty to make it. That is the first thing this war has done to the accountability gap. It has shared it out, and what is being shared out is not the responsibility. It is the ability to kill without it. International humanitarian law rests on 3 rules for any lawful attack. Distinguish combatants from civilians. Weigh the harm against the military gain. Take every feasible precaution. All 3 assume a uniformed soldier inside a chain of command. None of them assumes a florist in a basement. Each rule needs an actor who can carry it out. Distinction needs someone able to tell a fighter from a civilian and authorized to decide. Proportionality needs someone with the whole picture, weighing harm against advantage before the strike. Precaution needs the authority to call the attack off. In the basement to front chain, no single node holds any of those. The workshop produces, the unit deploys, the operator flies, the software assists, the legal function, the law requires, sits in no one's hands. The rules are not obsolete. They are still the only agreed framework there is. They were written for a world where the maker, the authority, and the capacity to judge were all visible, and that world has gone. The cost is not theoretical. The same camera that lets one operator strike a vehicle lets another track a civilian down a street. Over 8 months in one region, monitors documented drone attacks, killing dozens of civilians and wounding hundreds with what they called exceptional precision. A technology meant to sharpen distinction was turned against it. Autumn 2024. An operator launches a drone toward a target 4 kilometers away. 2 kilometers in, the screen goes black. A jammer has cut the link. A year before, that was the end of the mission. Now the drone keeps flying. A circuit board costing about $100 takes over. Its camera and a small neural network track the target. The operator locked before the signal died, and the drone finishes the strike alone. Ask who was in control at impact, and the honest answer is no one. The human chose the target. The machine completed the kill. Between those 2 moments, a jammer had cut every link a person could have used to stop it. This is a ratchet. Every advance in jamming forces more autonomy, and terminal guidance has lifted strike success from roughly 15% to 60%. The decade-old debate in Geneva over whether a human should stay in the loop is being overtaken by a battlefield where, more and more, a human physically cannot be. Next Friday, the series turns to Russia, where the same autonomous weapons are documented, deployed and counted, and where the framework meant to prevent them was written for states that chose to be bound by it. Lethal by Design runs every Friday through late August. The targeting did not start on the front. It started in orbit. Commercial satellites photographed the ground. A private platform software ranks the targets. A satellite internet network carries the data to a dish under a tarp. None of it is owned by a state. The most effective targeting in this war runs through products built and run by private companies. the satellite layer, the analytics platform, the communications network, a facial recognition tool given free early in the invasion. Every link is a commercial product. No link has a legal status that matches what it actually does. And here the argument reaches past this one war. International law already has a test for when a civilian joins the fight and becomes a lawful target. The Red Cross set it out in 2009, and the satellite operator very likely qualifies. No state has applied that test to the companies. Doing so would expose their staff and raise the cost of every defense technology deal. So the question goes unanswered by every government that benefits. For a board, the lesson is sharper than it looks. When mission-critical capability runs through a commercial platform, accountability is not weakened. It is written out of the contract. The provider's duty runs to its shareholders. The terms of service are not rules of engagement, and one company can make a call a government cannot reverse. 3 dimensions, 1 pattern. The gap democratized in a basement. The gap made physical by a jammer. The gap turned into a business model in orbit. In every case, the same choice, made again and again. At every node, someone chose capability over constraint, and no one chose to build the accountability that capability required. The government that funded civilian drone production instead of an oversight structure. The engineer who built autonomous navigation to beat the jammer, rather than a way to keep the human in. The company that put its platform inside the targeting chain and wrote its duties to its shareholders. None of it was hidden. Most of it was celebrated. The accountability gap in this war is not something that failed. It is a set of decisions that worked exactly as intended, taken by people who could see the alternative and chose not to take it. That is the through line of this whole series. The gap is not structural, it is chosen. It was chosen in a Gulf War briefing room in 1991. In a drone command chain over 2 decades, in a corporate boardroom, and now in a cave basement and a low orbit. The same preference every time. Capability over constraint. This is the precedent, not some future war. This one. Civilian production, machine-completed targeting, commercial infrastructure. The template every state now studies, and the framework that would govern it, has not been written. This book set 5 conditions that would show the accountability gap is closing. Meaningful human control written into binding law. A named human answerable for every autonomous strike. The makers and the platforms inside the legal frame, not outside it. Independent verification. Real consequence when the line is crossed. As of now, not one of the 5 has been met. Ukraine did not create the gap. It showed how wide it had always been, and how fast it spreads once the weapon costs $400 and the infrastructure is a subscription. The next war inherits all of it. The basements, the jammers, the orbital platforms, and the silence where the law should be. So here is the question this leaves of those 5 conditions. Distinction, a named human, the platforms inside the law. Verification, real consequence. Which one do you think is furthest from being met? Tell me in the comments. The book makes the full case, and the link is in the description. In 2018, a Russian robot tank was sent to Syria to prove itself in combat. It lost contact with its operators 17 times in a single month. The same program now fields drones that pick their own targets. This is the Hamberger report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, Enterprise Architect, Wellington. Report went to a defense conference in St. Petersburg. Sensors rated to see for miles managed barely a third of that range and went blind whenever the vehicle moved, fire commands stalled, or simply failed to send. The researchers' conclusion was blunt. The machine could not perform its tasks, and another 10 to 15 years of work were needed before it could. A separate account from the manufacturer's own marketing claimed the opposite: high performance in the field. The same system described 2 ways by 2 institutions with 2 incentives. In any Western program, the candid report ends the project. Instead, months later, the Army adopted the vehicle for service and announced every fault resolved. No review asked why 17 losses of control did not stop a deployment. No inspector examined the gap between the assessment and the announcement. The failure was not a malfunction. It was the method. There are two ways to build an autonomous weapon. One runs through procurement cycles, audits, and public records. The other runs from the battlefield straight back to the factory floor, with nothing in between. The first is slow, because oversight is built into it. Hearings, audit trails, the structural possibility that someone, somewhere has to answer. The second is fast, because that second term has been removed. Systems deploy before they are ready. Combat, not testing, decides what survives. The feedback loop runs from the front line to the assembly line, with no external checkpoint at any stage, no parliamentary equivalent demands to know why a failing system was fielded. No inspector investigates the distance between what the engineers concluded and what the generals announced. This is not a gap between capability and governance. It is the deliberate absence of governance, treated as a competitive advantage. And the cost of the iteration is not borne by the people refining the design. It is borne first in Syria and then in Ukraine by the people the systems are tested on. The robot tank's replacement was not bigger. It was smaller, cheaper, and far more lethal. A loitering munition called a Lancet, built in part in a converted shopping center. A Lancet costs around $35,000. The makers turned an abandoned shopping center into a production line in 2 months. By late 2023, open source trackers had logged hundreds of strikes, roughly a third of them destroying their target outright. By 2025, one analysis counted close to 1,500. A single strike can destroy a launcher or a howitzer worth 100 times more. The newest variant launches in a swarm from one container, each drone sharing target data with the others, each selecting its own target from preset categories, radar first, then air defense. Its chief designer said on state television that the system had already been used in fully autonomous mode in active combat. The processing runs on the same commercial AI modules that sit inside self-driving cars. The operator picks the area, the machine does the rest. Russia did not invent its most produced weapon, it licensed it. In late 2022, it agreed to build an Iranian drone design on its own soil, under an arrangement one newspaper described simply as a franchise. The design was the Shahad. The Russian version is the Garand 2. Production moved to a special economic zone, the size of 14 football fields, staffed, investigators found, partly through coercion and trafficking. Recruited workers, foreign laborers, teenagers from local colleges. By early 2026, Ukraine's military command reported 400 built every day, with a stated target of 1,000, enough by one estimate for 30,000 strikes a month. The unit cost fell from $200,000 to $70,000. A newer model swapped the propeller for a Chinese-made jet engine and a range of 950 kilometers. A cheap stand-in for a strategic cruise missile, assembled from parts no single export regime controlled. Next Friday, the series turns to where the design came from, an assembly line outside Isfahan and a $20,000 weapon that changed who can afford to wage autonomous war. Lethal by Design runs every Friday through late August. Pull one of these weapons apart and you find something uncomfortable. Not a triumph of Russian engineering, a map of everyone else's supply chain. Investigators who dismantled the wreckage traced the navigation modules, the processors, and the sensors to suppliers across more than half a dozen countries, moved through roughly 160 intermediary companies set up to stay ahead of export controls. The parts were commercial, the supply chains were the ones global enterprise runs on every day. For a board, the lesson is sharper than a compliance checklist. When a component you sell can end up in a weapon that no one will answer for, provenance stops being a procurement detail. It becomes a governance question. Who in your organization can actually say where your technology finally lands and who decides that the answer is good enough? While the weapons were being built and counted, their makers sat in the Geneva talks year after year, explaining why none of it needed a single new law. The position held for a decade. Existing humanitarian law is enough. Meaningful human control is, in their words, a subjective idea unrelated to law. Responsibility ends the moment a commander assigns the mission, and whatever the machine does between launch and impact is treated as engineering, not law. Researchers who read every submission found the real argument underneath. This was never only about weapons. It was about sovereignty, great power status, and a refusal to accept limits set by forums the state did not control. Each time the talks moved toward anything binding, the same delegation used the consensus rule to stop it, blocking even grammatical edits to the text, forcing the room into closed session, shutting out the observers who had helped build the process. One disarmament group wrote that the conference had been taken hostage. The forum was not failing despite that presence. It was failing because of it, working exactly as it was designed to work. Then came the votes the consensus rule could not block. 3 years running, the wider assembly counted where the world stood on these weapons. In the third year, the count changed. For 2 years, the maker of these weapons stood almost alone against even discussing limits. By the third year, it was no longer alone. One of the states that had launched the Responsible Use Declaration, the framework's own architect, voted the same way and stood beside the state that had blocked the process for a decade. The states with the most advanced autonomous weapons programs are arriving by different routes at the same destination, none willing to accept a binding rule. That is the mirror test. A framework that binds only the states that choose to be bound is not a framework. It is a preference held by some and declined by others, and the others are not all adversaries. The gap here was never an oversight. It is a position stated plainly in every submission. The law as it stands is sufficient, which means the weapons as they fly are lawful, which means the question of who answers has already been closed. Whether it stays closed is not Geneva's decision. It is everyone's. In 2011, an American stealth drone came down almost intact on Iranian soil. Within 3 years, its descendants were rolling off a production line. This is the Hamberger report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, enterprise architect, Wellington. The captured aircraft was a $6 million machine built to fly deep, see everything, and come home. What it gave the country that recovered it was not stealth. The copies were never as good as the original. What it gave them was something cheaper and more dangerous. The shape of a flying wing that could be built by the 100 and never needed to come back. Fly once, strike once, be replaced by the next airframe of the line. That single change in intent, from a machine designed to survive to a machine designed to be expendable, is where the economics of autonomous war turned. Not in a laboratory, on an assembly line. Over the next decade, that line would produce the most widely used attack drone of its kind anywhere, and it would do it under the most extensive sanctions regime applied to any state this century. The controls were there. The line ran anyway. The weapon that came off that line was not the most sophisticated drone in the world, not the longest range, not the most accurate. It was the most producible. And in a war of attrition, producibility is the only specification that matters. It is a delta wing, a little over 3 meters across, carbon fiber and foam, carrying a warhead of 40 to 50 kilograms. It runs on a small piston engine, reverse engineered from a European design, the low buzz that air defense crews learned to recognize before their radar did. It navigates by satellite, flies low and slow enough to slip under fast interceptors, launches off a truck-mounted rack, and does not return. The family scaled in both directions, a lighter, shorter range version, and later a jet-powered model that cut the time a defender had to react from minutes to seconds. Every variant was a different answer to the same question: how cheaply can a warhead be delivered to a fixed coordinate, and how expensively will the defender have to respond? That question, asked on a factory floor, reorganized the battlefield more than any breakthrough in a research lab. The strategic value of this weapon is captured in one number, around $35,000. That is the most cited estimate. Others put the true cost lower, closer to a few thousand, others higher, near 80,000 once you count the premium of evading sanctions. The precise figure matters less than the ratio. The guided interceptors fired to shoot these drones down cost between roughly $1 million and $4 million each. So even at the high estimate, the exchange runs more than 100 to 1. At the low estimate, several hundred to 1. Every cheap drone that forces a defender to burn an expensive missile has already won, whether or not it reaches its target. This is the interceptor trap. Defending against cheap autonomous munitions with costly guided interceptors cannot be sustained over any long campaign. The arithmetic does not care how advanced your air defense is. It was set on an assembly line by a decision to make a warhead that costs less than a family car and to make it by the thousand. The capability is not the interesting part. The choice to build it at that price, knowing exactly what it would do, is a design this cheap does not stay in one place. Within a decade, the same airframe was being built far from where it started, franchised onto foreign soil, copied by a movement at sea, and manufactured by an armed group that no treaty reaches. On one front, it was produced at an industrial estate at a rate that climbed to roughly 400 a day, with a stated target of 1,000. Investigators found that line was staffed in part through coercion and trafficking, including teenagers and workers recruited from across a continent under false promises. At sea, a movement in Yemen fielded its own copy and used it to attack shipping, helping cut container traffic through one of the world's busiest trade routes by about 90%. Inland, an armed group began building its own variants so that even destroying the supply line could not remove the capability. One design, 3 theaters, no single chain of accountability across any of them. Next Friday, the series turns to China, the one major power building this architecture by deliberate design, and to the calculation that could decide whether this gap becomes the world's default. Lethal by Design runs every Friday. The framework meant to prevent all this was not absent. It was documented, debated, and dismantled on a schedule. A Security Council resolution once barred these transfers. Its key restrictions were written to expire on a fixed date. When the date came, they lapsed automatically. The weapons transferred illegally before that date were now legal to sell. Those who had been sanctioned for moving them were quietly delisted. The line kept running. This is the heart of the series argument. The accountability gap is not an absence waiting for better policy, it is an architecture. When investigators dismantled these drones, roughly 4 in 5 of the microchips inside were made in the West, sold through legitimate channels, and routed to the line through front companies in a handful of permissive places. The controls were not missing. They were written, debated, and in one case timed to expire, which they did. For a board, that is the uncomfortable part. A control with a sunset is a control with a deadline. If the only thing between a component you sell and a weapon no one will answer for is a regime that is scheduled to lapse, then end-use governance cannot be left to that regime. Who in your organization actually owns the question of where your technology finally lands? In 2026, every strand of this network met in one war. The weapon built on that assembly line was turned back against the country that built it. An American firm had reverse engineered the same cheap drone at the same price and fired it the other way. In the opening hours, more than 1,000 targets were struck. A smart targeting system, built by an American defense software firm and running an artificial intelligence model from a major American company, generated hundreds of strike coordinates in those first hours, fusing satellite imagery, drone feeds, and signals data into packages for approval at a speed no earlier targeting cycle had reached. One detail captures the era. The maker of that model had been formally labeled a supply chain risk by the Defense Department one day before the war began. Hours later, the same model was helping choose the targets that opened the campaign. The cheapest precision weapon in history had been universalized, built now by the wealthiest power as well as the poorest, and the machine deciding where it fell was moving faster than any human review behind it. That speed is the next part of the story. The cost of it arrived in the first hour. 1 hour into that war, a precision missile struck an elementary school. The building had its own website, its own social media page, and walls that had separated it from the military site next door for years. 168 people were killed, more than 100 of them children, according to the human rights organization that investigated. The weapon was one used only by one side's forces in that campaign, the investigators found. The intelligence behind the strike was out of date. The targeting system either did not check or was not built to check. The law of armed conflict has a rule for exactly this. Those who plan an attack must do everything feasible to verify that the target is not a school, a home, or a protected place. The rule does not set a minimum time. It says verification must be feasible. When a system generates targets at machine speed, what counts as feasible depends on the databases behind it and on the humans given time. Here, the precaution was feasible, it was not taken. The question of who answers for that was not unanswerable, it was simply unanswered, because no one with authority over the system had been required to answer it. That is the gap made total, not an accident, a choice made by people who could already see it. In 2020, the People's Liberation Army published a doctrine that declared human judgment in the targeting loop a bottleneck, not a safeguard. This is the Hamberger report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, enterprise architect and AI governance practitioner, Wellington. That document, the SMS 2020, described the shift from what the PLA called informatized warfare to intelligentized warfare. Informatized warfare was about better data. Intelligentized warfare was about replacing human cognition in the decision cycle with machine cognition entirely. Li Minghai, a senior faculty member at China's National Defense University, put it in terms that stripped away every euphemism. The operational factors were changing from information in the lead to machines leading in battle. Human judgment, he wrote, was a competitive vulnerability. That framing did not appear in a classified briefing. It appeared in academic journals cited by the Jamestown Foundation in 2019. China published its theory of autonomous war openly as a strategic signal before it built most of the hardware to execute it. In 2017, Xi Jinping personally chaired a body whose mandate was to dissolve the boundary between civilian and military AI so completely that the distinction lost operational meaning. Military-civil fusion was not a partnership program, it was structural law. The doctrine was not waiting for the technology. The technology was being built to serve the doctrine. In 2017, Xi Jinping personally chaired the Military-Civil Fusion Development Commission, the body whose mandate was to dissolve the boundary between civilian and military AI development so completely that the distinction lost operational meaning. SenseTime and iFlyTech, both on the US entity list for surveillance links, maintained documented connections to PLA programs. The state-owned defense electronics conglomerate CETC demonstrated coordinated autonomous drone swarms at the Guangzhou Air Show. TJI, which controlled roughly 90% of the global consumer drone market by component share, manufactured platforms appearing with regularity in conflict theaters from Ukraine to Sudan. When DeepSeek R1 arrived in January 2025, matching or exceeding frontier American model benchmarks under chip-constrained conditions, the NVIDIA share price lost roughly $600 billion in a single day as investors recalculated the assumptions underlying American AI dominance. The founder told interviewers, "Money is never the problem, chip bans are the problem." Every Chinese AI company was already in the kill chain by design, not by contract. This is the speed problem, and it is the episode that drives everything else. Wargaming consistently finds that in Taiwan scenarios where the PLA employs autonomous systems, the human command chain on the other side cannot keep pace. If the PLA's autonomous systems can identify and engage targets faster than a human-authorized response can reach the same targets, the operational incentive to remove human authorization from your own systems becomes nearly irresistible. If China automates, the United States must automate to compete, and Taiwan must automate to survive. Each step removes another human from the decision chain. Each removal eliminates another point at which judgment, restraint, or legal accountability might be exercised. The fourth episode of Lethal by Design, covering Ukraine, documented how this logic first became operational in a live conflict. This episode is the same logic applied at civilizational scale. Watch Lethal by Design every Friday through August. You're in the right place. Next Friday, the scenario that may decide whether autonomous systems converge with nuclear weapons below the threshold of human reaction time. On 4 August 2022, the People's Liberation Army launched the largest military exercises around Taiwan since 1996. 11 ballistic missiles, 7 exclusion zones, 47 aircraft crossing the median line in a single day. The exercises were nominally a response to a congressional visit. Their structure communicated something more precise than diplomatic displeasure. The zones demonstrated the PLA's capacity to blockade the island entirely. The missiles demonstrated the capacity to strike it. The drones, small and slow above Kinmen, demonstrated that the next confrontation would not be conducted by manned aircraft alone. In December 2025, during exercises codenamed Justice Mission 2025, the Eastern Theater Command deployed drones that filmed the island's tallest building from overhead and released the footage on Chinese social media. A piece of psychological theater that also served as a proof of concept. PLA unmanned systems could reach the capital. The exercises had become rehearsals. The rehearsals increasingly featured machines. The hardware positioned for this scenario is not experimental. Satellite imagery identified more than 200 converted supersonic fighters at 6 air bases facing the strait. The cost exchange ratio is the weapon. For boards and executive teams in New Zealand and across the Five Eyes, the Taiwan scenario creates a specific governance question that is not about military posture. The Type 076 amphibious carrier, launched in December 2024, is designed to project autonomous air power from its flight deck. The Zhejiang drone carrier, which completed its maiden flight in December 2025, carries a 6-ton payload across 7,000 kilometers, sufficient to launch and recover combat drones from well beyond any island's defensive perimeter. The architecture being built is not a contingency plan, it is a fielded capability. The accountable question for every organization with technology or supply chain exposure in this theater is not whether this scenario might occur, it is whether your governance framework was designed for the world being built or the world that existed when it was written. China participated actively in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, sent senior diplomats, submitted working papers, made statements calling for a legally binding instrument. Then West Point analyzed the proposals and found the threshold was designed to exclude the systems China was actually building. China had proposed 5 cumulative technical characteristics for weapons. It would consider unacceptable. The system must be lethal, fully autonomous, impossible to terminate, indiscriminate, and capable of uncontrolled evolution. All 5 simultaneously. The Lieber Institute at West Point, in a 2026 analysis, concluded that China had drawn a remarkably narrow line that effectively excludes a wide range of emerging autonomous capabilities, many of which Beijing is developing. The Zhejiang drone carrier would not meet all 5 criteria. The Winglong operating under automated rules of engagement would not. The CETC swarm demonstrated publicly at Guangzhou would not. The threshold was designed to exclude the systems China was actually building. Every statement China made in Geneva was technically consistent with its military AI program. Human control in the PLA doctrine meant party control. The Central Military Commission authorized campaigns. Within those authorized parameters, machines could lead in battle freely. The CCW statements never contradicted the SMS 2020. They were written so as not to. In September 1983, a Soviet officer had minutes to decide whether 5 incoming missile signatures were real. He decided correctly because he could apply contextual reasoning the automated system could not. Now consider what replaces him. SIPRI concluded in 2020 that the interaction between autonomous conventional systems and nuclear forces created a new set of escalation risks that current arms control framework were not designed to address. 6 years later, no framework has been designed to address them. In November 2024, 2 heads of state agreed in principle that AI should not autonomously initiate nuclear launch decisions. The agreement contained no verification mechanism. It offered no definition of autonomous. It included no enforcement provision. The Taiwan scenario is where the 4 dimensions of the accountability gap converge simultaneously. Capability advancing on all sides, no accountability framework to assign it. governance producing declarations without mechanisms, and the question of whether democratic publics have authorized the autonomous systems being built in their name never meaningfully asked. China's accountability gap is not a gap. It is the doctrine. And the doctrine, exported at wing-long prices to 17 countries and counting, is the world's new baseline. In 1943, a new bomb sight promised pinpoint accuracy from 4 miles up. The promise outran the evidence for decades. That same claim, that precision alone makes lethal force accountable, is being made again now, at machine speed. This is the Hamberger Report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, Enterprise Architect, Wellington. This is an episode about what the book calls the proving grounds, the point where the accountability gap stops being a theory and becomes a record. Across the earlier episodes, 4 dimensions of that gap were traced one at a time: capability that outran the rules, accountability engineered out of the decision, governance that never constrained deployment, and legitimacy that was never sought. In the proving grounds, all 4 arrived together in the same campaigns at the same time. This is also the episode where the strongest argument on the other side gets a serious hearing. The claim is that precision reduces civilian harm. That claim deserves an honest answer, not a dismissal. The answer this analysis reaches is narrow. Precision without accountability is ungoverned, and ungoverned precision at machine speed has not delivered the protection its supporters promised. That is the case. The rest of this episode is the evidence for it, in 2 theaters and 1 honest test at the end. Start with the machinery. In one recent campaign, according to investigative reporting that human rights researchers later examined independently, military targeting was run through a set of automated systems that produced targets faster than any human process could check them. One system generated structural targets, buildings and facilities, at a rate that took target production from roughly 50 a year to about 100 a day. A second system worked on people. Using machine learning, it processed surveillance and communications data and gave nearly every person in a population of more than 2 million a score for probable affiliation. The reporting describes a resulting list of about 37,000 names. The part that matters most for accountability is the review. Several intelligence officers described spending about 20 seconds on each machine-generated target before a strike was authorized. The review confirmed that the name matched the person and that the person was male. It did not re-examine the intelligence or test the score or make a proportionality judgment for that specific case. One officer described their own role as a stamp of approval. That is not human control. It is the form of control with the substance taken out. Now apply the law. International humanitarian law rests on 2 obligations above all: distinctions separating combatants from civilians and proportionality, weighing expected civilian harm against a concrete military advantage. Both assume a specific human judgment for each attack. An algorithm that scores an entire population and produces a list of tens of thousands of names is doing something the distinction rule has never had to contend with. By the account of the people who built the system, the training data included civil defense workers, not only fighters, and the sources acknowledged an error rate of about 1 in 10 on a list that size. That is thousands of people who may have been civilians, marked anyway. Proportionality was handled the same way. According to the reporting, the system ran on preset casualty ratios, a standing allowance of 15 to 20 civilian deaths for a low-ranking target, and far higher figures for senior ones. A fixed ratio applied across thousands of targets at machine speed is not a proportionality assessment. Legal scholarship examining the precedent has concluded that preset thresholds fail the case-by-case test the law requires. The law was not absent. It was present in form and bypassed in practice. Here is where the other side of the argument earns its hearing. The case for these systems is not stupid, and it is not made in bad faith. It runs like this: a well-built targeting system can be steadier than a tired human analyst. Precision, the argument goes, means fewer mistakes, fewer wasted strikes, fewer civilians killed by accident. If that is true, then refusing the technology could cost lives the technology would have saved. That is a serious claim, and this analysis does not wave it away. The reply is narrow. Precision is a property of the weapon and the targeting. Accountability is a property of the system around them. A strike can be geometrically precise and still be selected by a process no one can reconstruct, reviewed by no one who can be named, and governed by no rule anyone agreed to. Precision of that kind has not been shown to reduce civilian harm where no one can be held to account for the result. Next Friday's episode closes the series. The Ungoverned Battlefield, publishing the 21st of August, tests this whole argument against 5 conditions that would show the gap is closing. Subscribe now so it reaches your feed. Step back for a moment to the governance question, because this is the part that reaches every organization that buys or builds these systems, and not only the ones that go to war. The institutions built to hold us to account have engaged. An international court has issued arrest warrants at the most senior level. Another international court is hearing a case brought under the Genocide Convention. United Nations officials have said publicly that automated targeting at this scale blurs responsibility and puts civilians at risk. Engagement, though, is not enforcement. The warrants have not been served. The provisional measures have not halted the campaigns. No treaty, before or during, set a minimum standard for human review of a machine-generated target or an acceptable error rate for algorithmic targeting in a populated area. For allied governments and for the enterprises inside their supply chains, including here in New Zealand. The practical point is this: a system marked precision compliant is not the same as a system whose lethal decisions can be reconstructed, contested, and answered for. Procurement language routinely treats the first as though it were the second. It is not. The second front in the proving grounds is smaller, but it shows the same gap from a different angle. Here the story is not one military's algorithm. It is how the methods of one war move into the next. A tactic refined over years on one battlefield. Cheap drones flown by a live video feed appeared on a new front within weeks. According to defense analysts tracking both, the hardware is commercial and costs a few $100s. What transfers is not the hardware. It is the doctrine, the hard-won knowledge of how to use it. And doctrine moves through people and supply chains that cross borders. The heart. When a strike is carried out this way, the accountability question has no clean answer. There is no national government that authorized it, no defense ministry that reviewed the targeting, no court with clear jurisdiction over the operator. The law of armed conflict was written for states that wage war, bear responsibility, and negotiate accountability. Confronted with a non-state group using weapons supplied by one state and methods derived from another, in a country whose government cannot control the fighting on its own soil, the law does not go silent. It simply has no floor to stand on. So return to the question this episode opened with. Does precision on its own make lethal force accountable? On the evidence from the proving grounds, the answer is no, and the reason is specific. At every stage, the record shows choices, not accidents. Engineers chose the training data. Officers chose to accept a known error rate. Commanders chose the standing casualty ratios. Leaderships chose to continue as the toll mounted. And the wider community, shown the evidence, chose statements of concern over mechanisms of enforcement. The technology compressed the decision. The people in the chain chose not to slow it down. That is what ungoverned precision means. Not that the machine is out of control, but that human control has been made ceremonial while keeping its legal name. The book's test is simple, and it is falsifiable. Find one case in any jurisdiction where a person was held legally accountable for an autonomous system's lethal error. As of the writing, that case did not exist. Next week, the series closes by asking what it would take for that to change. I'm Andreas Hamberger. This has been the Hamberger Report. In 2007, a philosopher asked who answers when an autonomous weapon kills the wrong person. Nobody had a good answer. By 2026, the systems he imagined were already fighting wars. This is the Hamberger Report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, Enterprise Architect, Wellington. 9 Fridays ago, this series opened with an autopilot that could not tell a barrage balloon from a Spitfire. Tonight, it closes in a conference room in Geneva, where the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons has met on and off for 13 years to discuss whether to regulate autonomous weapons. It has produced not one binding rule. During those same 13 years, autonomous weapons were deployed in Libya, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. Every episode in this series has documented a different theater, a different vendor, a different failure of accountability. Tonight, the argument closes. The gap this series has traced between what these systems can do and what anyone has authorized them to do is not a structural absence waiting on better diplomacy. It is a preference expressed by the states with the power to close it. At every meeting, every vote, every drafting session for 13 straight years, Sparrow's argument was simple. The person who builds the weapon does not choose the target. The commander who deploys it does not make the strike decision. The machine has no moral agency. Nobody in that chain can be held responsible for what happens next. In 2007, the philosopher Robert Sparrow published a paper called Killer Robots, working through exactly this problem. He considered three possible answers. The programmer wrote code that functions within general parameters. The outcome is not their intent. Holding a developer responsible for an autonomous system's unforeseen choice, Sparrow wrote, is like holding parents responsible for their adult children. The commander authorized deployment in a defined context, not the specific engagement that followed. And the machine itself cannot be punished, cannot be shamed, has no interest, any sanction can touch. Sparrow called the result a responsibility gap, a situation where the moral responsibility a harm deserves exceeds what can be pinned on any single agent. He argued the gap made autonomous lethal weapons inherently unjust, not because they choose wrongly, but because no one can be justly held to account for what they choose. 19 years on, the gap has not closed. It has scaled. 11 years. 0 senior reviews. Then, in Gaza, a targeting system generated thousands of recommendations, and a human operator approved each one in about 20 seconds. Policy called that appropriate human judgment. The United States policy on autonomous weapons, Directive 3000.09, was signed in 2012. It required a senior review before any autonomous system entered development. A 2019 Pentagon spokesperson confirmed that, to date, no weapon had ever undergone that review. 11 years, 0 reviews. The 2023 revision quietly removed the word control from the directive's own definition for what an official called technical accuracy. It also added a waiver for urgent military need, undefined. Meanwhile, the standard for what counts as meaningful control has never been agreed, and the International Committee of the Red Cross asks whether a human genuinely understood and could withhold approval. The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots asks whether a human individually identified the target. The United States asks only whether the review was appropriate to the operational tempo. Under that last standard, 20 seconds is not a shortcut around control. It is what control is now defined to mean. One thing before we go further, this is the last Friday of Lethal by Design. Next Friday, the 28th of August, Free as in Theft launches. This channel's other permanent Friday series, back to open source and the same accountability questions. Subscribe so it reaches your feed. The strongest counter-argument in this whole series deserves an honest answer. Military AI may make fewer targeting errors than a frightened human soldier, and a system that kills more precisely satisfies a real humanitarian obligation. That argument is honest. It is also not enough, because precision and accountability are different variables. A highly accurate weapon deployed by the wrong decision against the wrong target, with no one responsible for the outcome, has not closed the gap. It has dressed it up. In March 2026, a federal judge heard exactly this argument in miniature. An artificial intelligence company had refused to let its model be used for fully autonomous weapons, and the government branded that company a national security threat for saying no. The judge called the government's position Orwellian. The line held, this time, whether it holds next time was never the right question. The right question is why a courtroom, not a treaty, was the mechanism that finally worked. 96 drones can now launch from one vehicle, divide their own targets, and strike without a single human choosing which one dies. Sparrow's Gap did not just survive that scale-up. it became unanswerable. The same accountability gap that runs through this entire series reaches its widest point in swarm and mass-produced autonomous systems now entering Allied inventories, including the inventories of New Zealand's own defense partners. No treaty sets a human review standard for a system where one operator commands dozens of platforms simultaneously. No court has tested who answers when the decision that killed someone was never made by any single person. Export licenses and end-use assurances were written for a single weapon transferred to a single named operator, not for software that reallocates lethal decisions across a swarm in real time. For New Zealand enterprises sitting inside Allied supply chains, the practical question is not whether these systems will be procured, they already are. It is whether your own organization's governance can name who is accountable when a system you supplied, integrated, or advised on makes a decision no human individually authorized. A sitting United States senator said it plainly in committee. Congress has not set any statutory framework for how artificial intelligence can be used in lethal military operations. Nothing followed. No hearing, no vote, no bill. The largest shift in how any military selects targets since precision-guided munitions arrived was announced at a press conference, not voted on by any legislature. A strategy memorandum directed the Pentagon to become an artificial intelligence-first force, cleared safeguards it called blockers, and wrote into every new contract that a supplier's only permitted objection to a use of its technology was whether that use was lawful. For the civilian on the receiving end, the position is worse. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction in principle, but the states running the largest autonomous weapons programs are not meaningfully bound by it. Domestic courts have consistently declined to hear these cases at all, even where the person killed held citizenship of the country that killed them. That failure holds regardless of whether the state involved is an ally or an adversary. No treaty, no court, no vote. The oversight that exists is a reporting requirement, not an authorization requirement. And a report is not consent. 9 episodes, 9 theaters, one question running underneath all of them. Who authorized this? Not the engineers, not the commanders, not the diplomats. The honest answer across every chapter is no one. 5 conditions would count as real evidence the gap was closing: a binding treaty with enforcement, an operational human control standard that could be independently checked, parliamentary oversight with access to the classified detail, judicial review of an autonomous targeting decision, and a demonstrated record of anyone actually being held accountable. Not one has been met. A majority of the public, surveyed across 28 countries, opposes fully autonomous weapons outright. That opposition has no institutional channel to become policy. The series began with a weapon that could not tell a barrage balloon from a Spitfire. It closes with weapons that can select a human being for death faster than any court, legislature, or treaty has been asked to keep pace with. The gap was never a mystery. It was a series of choices made by people with names in institutions with addresses, none of whom were ever required to ask permission first.
That is the Hamberger report for today. If this was useful, subscribe and hit the like button. It helps more professionals find the channel. You will find links to everything we covered in the description below. I am Andreas Hamberger, and I will see you tomorrow.
Like and subscribe.